Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and Hunter's here with me today. H, so glad you're here.
Autumn, happy late summer to you. And how's your summer going?
It is going great. I had a few things that were like bigger commitments, events I had to lead, some camps, and then some personal commitments that also required, a lot of work and preparation. And so my summer was kind of front loaded. This week, I wouldn't say it feels slower. That's not necessarily how I'd describe it, but I'm back to more normal routines. My counterpart in kids ministry just went on maternity leave, so I still have plenty of work and things to do, but I've been home, and so that means I have been able to work in my garden a lot this last week, and there's another area of my yard that I wanted to turn into a native plant garden, and I got to start on it this week, which was really fun. You
are your most sanctified self, your true self, and most sanctified self when you are working in your garden. That's what I feel like.
I'm just curious about on what basis you say this, because you never see me when I'm working in my garden.
Well, I do see the fruit of what happens when you work in your garden. I've stopped by a few times, usually to drop off a bike for Jason to fix. And then there's this spectacular garden of both produce and plants, and I'm blown away. And if you run out of stuff to do or you need more sanctification, I have plenty for you to do. I like you front loaded the fun part of my summer, the travel and the vacation, and now the rest of my summer and into the fall are really, 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 really full because of a kind of a season we're going into as a church, and so it's more full even than a normal end of summer and fall. And what that looks like for me is I am out. I'm not home 5 nights out of 7, 6 nights out of 7, a lot of days. And so the time that I would normally spend just getting things done around the house is kind of squeezed. So I had this to-do list that has things on it like pull weeds in my flower bed and cut down trees of heaven and poison them so they will never come back. This just never gets done. So my flowers are looking rough, and my native flower bed could use your special touch.
Well, thanks for being so concerned about my continued sanctification. If I come across a little bit of time, maybe we could barter for it.
Maybe. Years ago, we had an arrangement where I almost convinced you to make my lunch every day. And,
that's right.
And I was going to pay you for that. And I feel like you were in a season then where you made really great lunches. I don't know. I feel like you've dropped off a little bit. Yeah. Life has got more full, but I feel like we could resurrect this with you being my gardener, essentially. It is your last name.
All right, I'll give it some thought.
Yeah.
We recently took a summer break and released last week a preview of our fall episodes, and it has been fun to hear from people over the last few weeks that they've missed us. So to those of you who have stopped me or emailed me and said you're eager for Vision for Life episodes to return, here we are with our second.
We should go away more often.
We should, with our second episode of this season. And while we're discussing summer, recently we being the United States of America, celebrated our 250th anniversary as a country. And when July 4th rolls around every year, of course, it provides an opportunity for journalists and different media figures to ask bigger existential questions about our country. And this year in particular, because of the 250th anniversary of our country, I think we saw that even to a greater extent than in most years. And you brought the article and podcast that we listened to and then kind of based our discussion today around to my attention. And this author, Jia Lynn Yang, is doing just that. She's asking some of the bigger kind of existential questions about the United States of America, and particularly about the stories of America.
I felt like the celebration of the 250th was a little bit more subdued than I thought it was going to be. Now, on the actual like July 3rd and 4th, I was barely in America. I was in Alaska, like way up on the tip. I could see Russia, on the tip of America. And I was in the part of Alaska that doesn't even have like not connected to the rest of Alaska with roads, So it was a little hard to know what was going on in America. Didn't even have internet on the 4th of July. But when I got back onto the grid, I was kind of catching up. And one of the things I listened to was a podcast that was done by The Daily, which is a New York Times podcast. And this author was on there, and she was talking about some of the competing narratives of the founding, especially of America, and how that affects how current people experience the 250th. And I probably disagree with this author a little bit ideologically, and yet I thought she framed up the debate that's happening and the way different people think about the founding, even people I know. I thought she framed up the tensions pretty well, and it just got me thinking about this from a Christian perspective. Like, how do we as Christians think about the founding of our country and the subsequent history of our country and the project that's now 250 years old of being this nation founded on these founding principles articulated like in the Declaration of Independence, in our Constitution, in our Bill of Rights. There's obviously a lot of debate in America about that. And I think this article and then listening to this author talk even more on that podcast helped me just understand some of this debate a little bit more and think about it.
The podcast that you're referencing was titled 250 Years Later, Why We're Still Fighting About Our Founding. And then the article that Yang wrote, which covered the same ground that the podcast discussed, the title is there a founding story that can unify left and right? So in this article, is Yang saying that there was a founding story and we've lost it? Were we once unified around a founding story? Or what's her central thesis? What is in that question? Is there a founding story that can unify left and right? What is she mostly wrestling with or wanting the readers to wrestle with?
Well, something for our listeners to note, I found the podcast to be a little clearer in framing up the tension than I did her article. And I think the interviewer on the podcast did a good job of bringing this tension out. But my summary would be this. There is kind of what you might call the traditional founding story of America. And this is what I learned in school growing up, that America is this experiment in liberty, that the founders, though imperfect men, were men of virtue and of wisdom, that the Declaration of Independence and then subsequently the Constitution kind of represents a great political achievement where we are establishing a nation of ideals and of laws. And then our subsequent history is a history of trying to live up, to those ideals. And this myth or this story, we'll talk about that term myth in a minute, it requires the founders to be men of extraordinary virtue. And then there's kind of a second story that has emerged as historians have kind of done work of like digging into the facts. And that story starts by questioning the virtue of the founders. And you could think about, for example, what we've learned about Thomas Jefferson and of course, the founders were slaveholders. Some of them were slaveholders. And think about Thomas Jefferson, the relationship that's been unearthed with Sally Hemings, his slave, and the children they have, and so the kind of historical revision is to say actually these were deeply flawed men. They were very compromised by slavery. The ideals they had were primarily given to landowners who were white men, and so America's prosperity even depended upon the exploitation of slaves, and the founding principles, didn't include marginalized people. And there's those two kind of things. It's hard to put those together into like one single story of like what is America. And there's been this tendency, especially on the left in our culture now, to emphasize more and more of the flawedness, almost to the point that it's hopeless. America is just hopelessly unjust. And I think there's been a reaction on the right to emphasize the ideals and the virtue of the founders. And what she brings out is like this, to emphasize the virtue of the founders is almost now conservative coded or right coded in American politics, and to emphasize the flaws and the problems is very left coded. And that's a lot of why Americans, are divided, or there's not a consensus on our founding. And then this is what the part that I found really fascinating about the podcast and about the article. She actually says we need to come up with a story that includes both of those strains, which is not something I expected to hear from someone who might be on the left, the ideological left. I didn't expect to hear that, but she starts to talk about that, and she brings up the idea of myth, which doesn't mean like a made-up story, but it is a story that has meaning and gives us direction for the future. So I was fascinated to hear her talk about that and a little bit surprised.
I want to go back to a word you used a moment ago, Hunter, and that's the word myth. Yang uses this in the article. They reference it in the podcast, and it's being used in a specific sense in both. So what does she mean by myth, and why is it important in the consideration of this unifying story?
When we hear the word myth, we often think a made-up story or a fairy tale, so to speak. But she's using that term in its more classical sense, which is a historical narrative that we use in the present to make sense of our meaning and our purpose. And so she's saying we need a way of telling about the history of the American founding in a way that emphasizes both the ideals and the flaws. And we can use both the ideals and the flaws in order to call us to something good, as a nation, something we should pursue as a people. This is the way she's using the term myth. And I think the best myths are honest tellings of history, but they're honest tellings of history in a way that point us, to purpose and to meaning. And so that's what she's arguing for in this article and on that podcast.
And it becomes so important because Yang points out that America, the United States of America, unlike most nations whose identity is grounded in something like a common ancestry or a geographic region, so a particular territory, that the United States is fundamentally different, that it was a nation founded on an idea or ideas and ideals. And that is not the way that most countries throughout history have come about. That's not the founding story of most nations. And so she's pointing out that this myth, this story that gives us purpose and understanding is incredibly important for the unifying of a group of people who don't have a lot of other unifying factors that are shared among them. And that made me think of another book that you have referenced in the past. We haven't talked about it for a while, Hunter, but it's by Jill Lepore, who's a historian and a Harvard professor. She wrote a book called These Truths, and she points out many of these similar themes. Obviously, it's a book. It's a much longer work than this article. But Lepore also points out the same thing that Yang is bringing to our attention, that this founding story functioned in a very significant way for the American people. And when, as you referenced, this second story or the counter story, the revisionist kind of story that progressives began to advocate for in examining the founders, calling into question even not only them, but the ideals that they lived by. When that began to happen, really, as you said, Hunter, these two strains began to develop, the traditional founding myth and then the revisionist or counter myth. And both Yang and Lepore then are advocating this kind of third way, which you referenced a moment. And I want us to discuss that a little bit more. What is the danger that they're pointing out, that both Yang and Lepore in her work are pointing out in these two competing stories?
Well, first of all, just a note for our listeners, I really became aware of Jill Lepore's work through an interview she did with Albert Mohler, who is the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kentucky and very much sits on the political right. And I was actually surprised that she came on his podcast and talked about the history of America, and yet they found a lot of common ground. This was an interview in 2018, and they found a lot of common ground on understanding that America was founded on ideals of liberty and of justice, and that there has been a project since then of trying to extend liberty and justice to all citizens, not just the landowners and not just the privileged few that maybe got it in the founding. And I found that to be a refreshing agreement between two people on different, parts of the political spectrum on what the purpose and history of America actually means and making sense of it. And Lepore had made the point that she's a historian, and she was concerned that historians had given up on the work of telling a story of America that provided some kind of directional myth, that they had really become jaded on the history of America, that in some sense they had lost any sense of the ideals that America was founded on. They had almost overemphasized the injustice narrative, and in overemphasizing the injustice narrative, they had lost track of the ideal narrative, and therefore they had relinquished the task of telling the story of America in a way that was helpful to modern people. And so she wrote a long history book called These Truths, and she's trying to do that. And then when she was doing her book tour, she comes on and does this interview with Albert Mohler, and he seemed to really appreciate the work that she was doing. She later released a much, much smaller book, like a 90-page book called This America, and she is maybe a summary of the thesis behind her, her larger history work. So I found that all to be fascinating. That's where I got turned on to her work, and she's the first person that helped me see. And that interview with Dr. Mohler was one of the first places I really began to see these two competing narratives. Maybe I sensed that they were happening in our world, but I began to understand these two competing narratives and think about how we might tell a story of America that acknowledges both the real wisdom and virtue of the founders and the founding, also their flaws, also the injustice, especially of slavery, and the consequences that we are still dealing with of slavery in our country, but gives us hope for moving forward and doesn't just say, therefore America is a hopelessly corrupt and broken project that cannot be salvaged.
I think both Yang and Lepore are bringing something to our attention that could be summarized in this question. What happens when we stop believing the story or this founding myth that has held us together?
Well, I think what happens is the body politic really starts to disintegrate or to polarize. But it starts, I think, not with just not believing the story, but not agreeing on what the story is. And so because we don't agree on what the story is, we can't believe the same story. And I think they're trying to guard us against two errors. One is telling an overly idealized portrait of America's founding that doesn't acknowledge any flaws in the founders. And the other is seeing the flaws, letting the flaws be so big and that we think the ideals are hopeless. And maybe we say if the nation can't be perfect, and if it wasn't founded on by perfect men, then it can't have any future that is hopeful. And I see a lot of that pessimism existing on especially the American left. And then I see a tendency to maybe polish over the flaws happening on the right. And this is, I think, keeping us from agreeing on the story in a way that would help us to have good arguments and constructive debate about how to move forward. Now, I'm bringing this to our listeners because I'm thinking about how do I as a Christian sit in this country that is not my highest allegiance. My highest allegiance is the kingdom of God, and yet I'm a citizen of this country. I'm very thankful to live in America. I'm very thankful to be a citizen of America. And how does my Christian faith relate to this national debate that is going on? And what does it look like for me as a Christian to be a citizen of the kingdom of God and also a citizen of the United States and keep them in the right order? So that's the reason I'm interested in this whole discussion.
I think that's such an important consideration because ultimately that is where we want to land in our conversation today. But we're going to put a pin in that for just a moment. And I want to circle back to the discussion of these kind of two competing stories again, and the fact that they then are forming around their own sets of morals or moral values or ideals. And so on the one hand, we have this traditional story that is, as you said, often glosses over the sins or the realities of the founding fathers' imperfections or the ways that they fell short of the ideals that they espoused. And on the other hand, we have this narrative that says because the founding fathers were not virtuous, were imperfect, as you said a moment ago, then the ideals themselves should be called into question. And so both of those stories, though, they don't agree on a shared set of either ideas or facts even. Really, the interpretation of this founding myth is taking shape in two totally different ways. And both get then more extreme. And you had said previously, Hunter, that in light of the fact that progressivism, the progressive narrative around this says really America is in some sense a failed experiment. Perhaps it's irredeemably racist. Then there's an equal reaction on the right. So what then happens in light of this story that actually creates more polarization?
Yeah, I think people go to their corners, so to speak, and you're right. There's a strong narrative on the left that America is irredeemably racist, and because it's irredeemably racist, they're not really even involved in trying to construct a future based on the founding ideals. What happens, it becomes more of a power struggle. So because these people are irredeemably racist, then the only solution is to get the wrong people out of power and the right people into power. It becomes a power struggle. And then there's a lot of energy on the right, I think, to emphasize the ideals of America, but sometimes not as much energy to acknowledge, even just to acknowledge the reality of slavery and the consequences thereof, and just to acknowledge that. And sometimes there's some attempts to even revise how we think of history so that we don't even think of things like the civil rights movement, for example, as progress toward, our ideals. Now, right there, I'm kind of hinting at what I think is the best approach, which is I think the best approach is emphasize the founding ideals and acknowledge the injustice and use the ideals to pursue a just society. I think Abraham Lincoln is a representation of that. He's calling America to our founding ideals. I think Martin Luther King Jr. spoke this language. He spoke the language of the founding. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and then he argues, but this has not been extended to Black people in America, and so we are now calling on America to be true to her founding ideals. So it's reform, but it's reform according to the ideals, and so even people who maybe don't think there's as much injustice as Martin Luther King thinks there is, at least we're reading the same ideals. We're reading the same book, so to speak, right? She cites Frederick Douglass a lot as an example of someone who was deeply grieved by racism and yet called America to be true to the founding ideals. So at least these people are appealing to the same thing. I think that's the way forward, and not that we're gonna all agree, but at least the conversation is going to be politically, constructive in that.
I like that you're pointing out, Hunter, that there were figures, historical figures who we can look to who actually did what Yang is stating in this article is this sort of third way. They looked to the ideals on which America was founded, recognized that we as a country, particularly political leaders, but we as a country had fallen short of those, and then called the country to live into those ideals or to embody them. One figure who comes to my mind, one historical figure, is Frederick Douglass. And this is captured so well in his well-known speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. I want to read just a part of it because I think it gets at exactly what you were describing a moment ago. It says, "Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men too, great enough to give frame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise, at one time, such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not, certainly, the most favorable. And yet, I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory." And I think in that portion of Douglass's speech, it captures this third way, a recognition. He's even acknowledging his own complicated relationship to these men and, in some sense, then to the nation that they founded. And yet he also is recognizing them for their unique position, for this extraordinary act of founding a country, and for the ideals that they espoused. So I think that encapsulates so well what you were just describing.
And I'm glad you read that because there's this long strain of in American history of people appealing for progress on justice and on our founding ideals by both honoring the wisdom and also critiquing some of the imperfections, and that's an excellent example of that. Thanks for reading that.
So let's come back to what you mentioned a few moments ago, Hunter, when I said let's put a pin in that topic and ask, how do we navigate then these competing stories of America as Christians?
I think Christianity gives us a worldview in which we can not only engage this debate well, but we can actually bring something very important to it that's more and more important in a secular culture. And a secular culture is one that only believes in the here and now. They do not believe in anything eschatological, as we say as Christians, meaning future things. So they do not believe in eternity. They do not believe that there is a future kingdom that is coming where God will establish a world of perfect justice, righteousness, and equity. And because they don't believe in a future, secularism loads all of our needs for meaning and purpose and justice. It loads it all into the present. And it means if we don't get it in the present, we'll never get it, right? And so in some ways, I think secularism creates highly anxious people who don't know what to do with problems in the world, because if there's any problem in society or there's any problem in the church, all meaning and all hope is just for justice is destroyed. So secularism, as our countries become more secular, it's not surprising to me that we become more angsty about our founding and about our present, and some have lost hope, so to speak, because there's really no way for these tensions to be resolved unless we, as humans, figure it all out. So as Christians, I think we have a unique contribution to make, and that is because we hope in a kingdom that is to come, and we know that God is going to make all things right. We do not overbelieve the amount of perfection that is attainable, here before the kingdom comes in full. But that doesn't make us just like, well, we just wait for the kingdom. It doesn't make us passive. We also believe that God is working in history and that He's sovereign in history, and we do believe that progress is available to us, even if it's not going to reach perfection, right? And because of that, we have a worldview that is perfectly situated to say human societies can be more or less just. They can be more or less ideal, and it's okay to believe that one form of human civilization with its laws and its principles is more just, and then a different form, and we could think of examples right now in our world. Would you rather live in the civilization that is America, or would you rather live in the civilization that is Venezuela right now? Those are two societies founded on completely different principles, and we would definitely say one is more just and more healthy than the other. So we can see these differences, and we can work toward progress in our world without having to believe that it's all on us to achieve perfection here and now. And I think that's a unique contribution that Christians bring. Mm-hmm. It allows us to be hopeful and honest.
I think Jesus modeled that, what you're talking about, when he was incarnated and entered into human history at a specific place and time. The expectations of the people around him were that the way he would lead would be by claiming power. And he actually taught his followers then to see culture in the way you're describing, that there were redemptive aspects of it and aspects that needed to be confronted, that were less just or that were sinful. And in teaching his followers to see their surrounding culture in that way, he gave them unexpected answers, and he actually pointed them continually to the ideals of his kingdom, which was forward-looking, and said that they could live out those ideals then in whatever culture or state of power or governance system they were under. And so there's this aspect of the way that we live faithfully as Christians actually can be unaffected in one sense by where we are in time. And in another sense, there's this very real pattern that Jesus gave us that you're also talking about here, Hunter, that is to see your culture through that lens.
And Jesus did claim power. He said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me after his resurrection. It's a big power claim. And yet the way he exercises his power is sovereignty over human affairs in history until his kingdom comes in full. And then when his kingdom comes in full, he literally reigns on the earth. So that was not what his disciples were expecting. They were just expecting him to reign on the earth, right now. And they weren't expecting this period of time where it's now 2,000 years where he's sovereignly reigning over the effects of the ebb and flow of history. So we have to integrate that into our life. And I think integrating that into your life and into your worldview helps you be a good citizen of the kingdom of the world today. I also am concerned as a pastor. I want to guard Christians against the two polarized narratives because I think they have negative spiritual effects, and they actually distort the gospel in people's minds. So I want to guard them from the need to make America a perfect bastion of liberty and justice, and to make the founders saints in the perfect sense. I want to guard them against that because I think it's factually dishonest, and that doesn't lend credibility to our witness, and it causes us to overhope in our present kingdom and to underhope in the future kingdom that is coming. So I want to guard Christians against an over-idealized picture of the founders. I don't want to guard them against showing the virtues of the founders and seeing the ideals the founders were committed to. We can honor them, just as Frederick Douglass said. I also want to guard them against, and this is probably even more of a concern where I pastor in Denver, I want to guard them against the narrative on the left that we live in an irredeemably racist society that cannot be cured, because that narrative actually just tears people apart. And I've watched, even when it gets into churches, that it tears churches apart. And it causes the people who buy into that narrative, it causes them to I think see problems where problems don't exist, and to make accusations where accusations don't exist, and they just become miserable people who are hard to live with. So I don't want anyone to be a miserable person who's hard to live with.
Yeah, no, I don't think any of us want that, Hunter.
Yeah, don't become a miserable person. It's hard to live with.
Be a miserable person or to...
But it'll sneak up on you.
It'll sneak up on you. So guard against that. That really also is an enemy of unity. If you're a miserable person,
it really is
hard to live with.
It really is. We're told in Scripture to bear with one another.
We are. I think as we round out our conversation today, what comes to mind is that we have a unique way that we are called to live in unity alongside other Christians, so alongside other people who are part of the family of God. And Scripture tells us that we have one God and one Spirit, and that we share. Because we share in that Spirit, we experience unity as one people of God. And so, of course, as we were discussing today, that unity transcends these kinds of cultural trappings. But we are impacted and affected by the place and time that we live in. We have this model as the people of God, and then we can wisely, as Christians, navigate really sometimes contentious and fractious age that we're experiencing in America. We can look with hope to Christ who will come and reign into his kingdom. And as we navigate just the reality of our present age, we can do so by asking, where do the ideals of our founding align with Scripture? Where is there resonance, gospel resonance, and real redemptive possibility to see some of the principles of God's kingdom lived out through us, through the people of God who live now in this present age? And this third way that we were talking about today actually allows us to do this. It allows us to see where in those ideals there's a representation of gospel truth, and to pursue that, and to look to the story of America in a way that does what Yang is suggesting we do in having a founding myth, a shared story, another way in which we experience just commonality with the people around us. Well, Hunter, thanks for having this conversation with me today. And to those of you listening, we love hearing from you. We are going to continue to integrate episodes into this fall that are based on your suggestions and your questions.
Send us all the suggestions about us. We mean autumn.
That's right. Send us all the suggestions. So if you have articles that you're reading that you think we would find interesting, that you want to share, would make a good basis for conversation, or questions that you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast, send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.